Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Margaret Long. I will be your moderator for today's discussion, Midterm Elections, Winners, Losers, and a New Era of Civility. This is presented by Spectrum, and thank you so much for taking your time to join us this morning. The discussion today, as you've heard, you all are in listen-only mode, and there will be a replay available after if you're unable to stay through the entire hour, but we certainly hope you will join us for the entire hour. There is a chat box, and if you do have questions as the discussion is progressing, please feel free to add them into the chat box, and if we have time, we most certainly will try to address them. Let me start by introducing our panelists and myself. As I said, I am your moderator today. My name is Margaret Long, and I am the principal at Willow Point Consulting Group. We are a biopharma public affairs consulting organization. We have guests today from both the state and federal side of government, and I am going to allow them to introduce themselves. So let me turn this over to our first guest this morning, Kevin Kinnan.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And, thanks for Spectrum for hosting. Appreciate it. My name again is Kevin Kinnan. I'm the managing partner of Main Street Advocates. We're a state and local consulting firm based in Georgetown. We do what I call national, state, and local politics. We help clients work at the state and local level across the country on behalf of their needs at the state and local level. I come out of state and local government. I worked for the mayor of Boston for many years. I worked for a former governor of Massachusetts, a state senate president, and attorney general. I also did some time at the federal level working in Congress as well as in the White House. Thanks again.
Thank you, Kevin. Let me turn it over to John.
Sure. Thanks, Margaret. Happy to be here. Hopefully have some interesting insights for you all today. So again, my name is John Ray. I'm Director of Government Affairs with Kimball & Associates. We're a small health policy lobbying and firm. We do 100% healthcare clients, mostly in the pharmaceutical and medical device space. So I've been here for a couple of years, was at a doctor trade association before that, and before that I worked for Congressman Mike Kelly, who's on the Ways and Means Health Subcommittee, doing healthcare issues for him.
Thank you, John.
Hey, and thanks for that, Margaret. David Redloff. I'm Manager of Government Affairs, also with Kimball & Associates, and excited to talk to you guys today. I have a little bit of background in political campaigns, and I've been at Kimball & Associates for almost a year and a half, helping them out on the lobbying team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you, for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. Really appreciate it. So as far as an agenda for the call, we really want to talk through what is the post-election reality, have a conversation about what the gubernatorial elections and state legislative body elections mean looking forward, and ultimately, of course, how quickly we will be moving into the 2020 election cycle, which I venture to say is more quickly than any of us could possibly have stomach for, and some key takeaways for healthcare. So that's the basis for the discussion today. I'd like to kick that off with the new congressional reality. So let's start, if we can, with the current situation in the 116th Congress in the House.
And so you can see right now, looks like Democrats are going to pick up anywhere from 35 to 39 seats. There's still a number of races to be called. But so they're going to end up with, 35-seat majority. Gives them a little bit of breathing room. This is kind of where I expected it to be. I think in my election prediction contest, I said 39-seat pickup. I think it likely will be 38. So patting myself on the back there. But it's still a pretty slim majority, right? The Democrats will have a little bit more than a dozen seats to play with as far as tough votes. But similar to the Republican majority we have today, and we'll see what kind of chasms are created in the Democratic caucus. Obviously, a big theme of the election was a number of progressive candidates that were pulling the Democratic Party to the left, got a lot of press. Some did well, some came up disappointingly short for others. And of course, the other dynamic, I think, is you look at a lot of where the seats flipped, where Democrats flipped a lot of the seats. A lot of them were, formerly red suburban districts across the country, mostly on the coasts, or centered in, again, suburban areas of big cities. And so those districts, again, would be naturally more moderate. For instance, I'm from Pennsylvania, grew up just outside of Philadelphia. Those suburbs were kind of ground zero for that. You saw Ryan Costello, Republican there. He retired instead of running a race he was probably going to lose. And all those seats basically went from red for the last 15 years plus, flipped to blue. But those are still fairly moderate suburban districts. So I think that dynamic will be really interesting as it plays out. How will Democrats manage that? Obviously, we've seen the Republicans struggle, trying to herd cats, get the Freedom Caucus in line. And the Freedom Caucus, for a core of 25, 28 members, whatever it was, certainly exerted a ton of influence on the House the last few years, few cycles. So will Progressive Caucus and the Democratic majority be able to do that? Will a more moderate caucus emerge? The Blue Dogs are kind of gone, but maybe a chance to make a reemergence after kind of getting wiped out fairly significantly in the 2011 wave. And I think that's obviously the best analog we have in recent history is looking at that. I think there'll be 92 new members of the House next year. In 2011, we had 94 new members come in. And again, a lot of those, on the Republican side, similar to the Democratic side, most of the moderate Republicans, or a significant number of moderate Republicans lost this cycle. So again, the Republican caucus will be significantly more right than it has been. Being maybe even a dozen plus new members to the Freedom Caucus, and so all of a sudden, instead of a small kind of contingent, they become a significant percentage of the overall body for Republicans. So those are the dynamics in the House that I think will be really interesting to watch play out. And of course, right off the bat with leadership elections in both chambers, I think we'll get a preview of how that will go. On the Democratic side, they pushed their elections back till after Thanksgiving, which I think allows more chance for some mischief. Nancy Pelosi is obviously the front runner. I think by all indications, I think everybody in the city would be shocked if she is not our Speaker of the House come January 3rd. But at the same time, the reports are there. We know, I think it was about 40 candidates on the Democratic side pledged to not vote for her. Of course, they all did not come in, but she still has a small contingent that's kind of a never Pelosi contingent. We'll see if they come around. And remember, for Speaker of the House, you have to get a majority of votes on the floor. So for Majority Leader, you only need a majority of your caucus. But so Pelosi, or whoever's running for Speaker, can't afford to lose more than about a dozen votes for Speaker. So I think, like I said, by all indications, she'll keep it. If that's kind of the buzzword is the caretaker Speaker role, right? That she might take it, step into it for a year, and then try to turn it over to somebody else next year, going to 2020, or pledge to step down after this Congress and turn it over to somebody else. So she's making her calls, but definitely up in the air.
So thank you, John. Let me ask a question. If we make the assumption that Nancy Pelosi is the next Speaker, what does that mean for key committee leadership and the committees of interest to the healthcare sector?
Yeah. Well, I will say, Democrats definitely love seniority. You see that, again, leadership with Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, James Clyburn lined up to be the 1, 2, 3s. In leadership and then committees, same deal. I mean, I think, on the Energy and Commerce Committee, you're going to end up with Frank Pallone from New Jersey, who for the pharmaceutical industry has always been a thorn in the side. And I think with him rising to the top of that committee, I don't think that's going to let up at all. In Ways and Means, you'll have Richard Neal from Massachusetts. So two East Coast Democrats that have been around a long time, have seen a lot, and have significant seniority. And I think they are, they've been in the minority now for the better part of a decade, and I think they're chomping at the bit to exercise some of their rights as committee chairman.
Thank you so much for that great overview. Let's turn it over here to David, and let's talk a little bit about the Senate at this point.
Hey, so on the Senate side, kind of the opposite where we had the House, where the Democrats were universally expected to take the House. Kind of the opposite with the Senate. The Republicans were favored. I think the Washington consensus was that they might gain seats. So roughly 1/3 of the Senate was up for election last week. And what we had was a particularly unusual scenario where the Democrats were defending 26 seats, and the Republicans were only defending 9. And of these seats, 10 of the Democratic seats were in states that Trump won in 2016, and only one was in a state that Clinton won, which is Dean Heller's in Nevada, one Republican that is. And so what happened on Election Day? We saw Republicans picked up 3 Democratic states or seats in Indiana, North Dakota, and Missouri, and the Democrats picked up 2, which is Dean Heller's seat in Nevada, and also last night they called the Arizona race, so that went to Kristen Sinema, who beat Martha McSally in Arizona, so that's 2 for the Democrats. And we still have 2 outstanding races. One is a special election in Mississippi where Cindy Hyde-Smith will take on Mike Epstein, and what is expected to be a Republican win. And then the other is in Florida where Rick Scott defeated incumbent Senator Bill Nelson on Election Day. But that race is still yet to be called and undergoing a recount. It is important to note that Rick Scott has actually come to Washington already and has said that he will vote in leadership elections. So he is treating it as if he won. So that's what happened, and the Republicans look poised to expand their majority by at least 1 seat with Mississippi, maybe 2 given Florida, and so you see them retain their majority in the Senate. And
so David, let me ask on the leadership front.
Yeah.
So unlike the House, with retaining the majority, Mitch McConnell remains the leader in the Senate.
Yeah.
Do you see any changes to committee chairmanship or other leadership positions?
On the healthcare committee side, everything more or less remains the same. The only difference is that Chuck Grassley is expected to be the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee with Orrin Hatch's retirement, who is being replaced by Mitt Romney. So Grassley is supposed to chair finance. On the health committee side, it will still be Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray. So nothing is expected to change on that side. In terms of overall leadership, you have Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell. So not as much change as the House on the Senate side in that regard. For a little bit of the insight into the races, I think we saw a trend of how Trump's direct impact in the races really affected them. And you can argue that he may have hurt a lot of moderate Republicans in suburban districts on the House side, but he ended up actually helping a lot of Republican candidates in Senate seats that in red states that overwhelmingly voted for him in 2016, and where he had continued support. So places like Missouri, Indiana, North Dakota, and even Montana, where the Republican narrowly lost against incumbent John Tester. So I volunteered. I played a role on the Braun campaign in Indiana, so I have a little insight to that campaign, and you could see how Braun was trailing in the polls, and Trump came and he campaigned there twice, and immediately after he came, it was a media circus. The locals, really, everyone in Indiana was very fired up about it, and you could see his numbers shoot up in the polls, and that really helped Mike Braun in that race, and particularly. And you could also see another thing about that race is you saw the Kavanaugh bump, where it may not have played a role as in other Senate races. It played a big role in these red state ones with blue incumbents, because we saw Mike Braun shoot up right in the polls after that happened, because it leveled that enthusiasm gap and sent more Republicans to the polls.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that insight. Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you to give us the state of the state.
Sure, sounds good. A little less of the horse race just because there's obviously not majority minority, because governors obviously are sort of the chief executives of their individual states. We have 36 races up this year, a ton of races obviously in governors around the country. Going into Election Day, Republicans held a historical high of 33 gubernatorial seats. The D's had 16, and Alaska, Bill Walker, current governor, is an independent right now. Going into 2019, what we'll end up with is Republicans will hold at least 25, likely-ish 27, with the Democrats having 23. As you can see, if you're looking at the map, the two pink states, Brian Kemp holds a 58,000 vote lead currently, or last time I checked, over Stacey Abrams in the state of Georgia. And Andrew Gillum is down a little over half a percentage point to Ron DeSantis in the state of Florida. What's interesting to note about the Georgia race is Kemp currently holds 50.3%. If he goes below 50 plus one vote, there's an automatic runoff. You need 50 plus one. There was a third-party candidate in the race that got a little over 1% out there. So things are tight in both of those areas right now. I think something that we haven't talked about that is important, we heard this going into Election Day a lot and then after. Was there a blue wave coming as a result of the Trump presidency? The midterms, historically presidents don't do well in their first term going into the midterms. As it relates to the state level of things, the Democrats flipped 7 governorships. They also flipped 6 legislative chambers and about 300 Senate, state, House, and Senate seats. Now, there were 6,066 state legislative races out there. So the percentages are not big, but it's important to note, and it behooves me to talk briefly about state legislatures. What's fascinating to know in state legislatures is there's only one state left that one party doesn't control the entire legislature. That is, all Ds or all Rs having both their House and Senate, and that's the state of Minnesota, which going into Election Day was tied 33-33 with one vacancy. Minnesota now holds, the Republicans now hold a 1-vote majority in the Senate. And then there's also the outlier of Nebraska. For those folks who don't follow Nebraska politics, Nebraska is a unicameral state with one legislature that is supposedly nonpartisan, although they tend to tilt a little more conservative.
Thank you. Excellent insights. Do you think the one-party control will have real impact in terms of getting things done in 2019?
It does. I think it goes in line with the partisanship of states tending to go one way or the other. You do have your outliers, though. You look at the state of Maryland, where I'm a resident, state of Massachusetts, where I was a longtime resident, that are pretty liberal states with very liberal legislatures generally, but with Republican governors. Part of that is sort of a check and balance on behalf of the voters of those states. You also see in those states, though, that oftentimes you might have very high-level, this didn't happen in this gubernatorial election, but high-level statewide officials who are all in the Democratic primary in states like that we've had in the past. Somebody loses who's the speaker or a statewide elected official and says, I'm going to say I'm going to support them, but I'm really not overall. I think as it relates to health care, something else I want to bring up quickly is there are 37 states now that have expanded Medicaid in the states. The state Medicaid, for folks who don't follow the state, it's one of, if not the biggest issue facing state budgets in every state. 3 states now, Idaho, Utah, and Nebraska, very conservative states, all passed ballot initiatives to allow state Medicaid programs to expand. And with Janet Mills, who's the current Attorney General of the state of Maine, a Democrat winning the gubernatorial race in Maine, taking over for Paula Page, who is term limited, who is a very conservative person who likes to say, I was Trump before Trump was Trump, who while the voters allowed Medicaid to expand in the state, he had blocked it the whole time. So you're going to see at least 4 states now looking for federal dollars in some way from D.C. to expand their Medicaid population and get some cash for their residents on Medicaid.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Thanks to all of you for that overview. I much appreciate your insights here, and I'd love to turn this into a conversation at this point. I'd like to talk about, I think, what everyone here in the room knows and those on the phone, that I think the election day exit polls actually reinforced, and that is that healthcare remains a top issue for the American people. Post-election, I mean, where do you see healthcare falling? And please, we won't round robin it so much as just feel free to comment on the agenda, for example, of the House and the Senate and the governors, particularly, and legislators.
I think, for Democrats in the House, I think healthcare, setting aside, I guess, the president, as a kind of monolith, but healthcare, as far as issues go, is definitely top of the list. I think you saw throughout the election, while, here in the bubble, we heard tons about immigration, et cetera, other issues. I know, around the states and in the districts, Democrats just hammered healthcare over and over and over. I think you saw 40% of voters in the exit polls said healthcare was their number one issue while they were voting, and that was because of a very dedicated, very focused, and disciplined message, I think, from Democrats across the country on healthcare. Everyone feels that pinch, whether it's premiums or related or otherwise, and it resonated. So I think for them, they know that. They know that was part of the reason they did well, and I think that will be top of their list. That includes Affordable Care Act, stabilizing that. I think you obviously have seen, hopefully, the end of repeal and replace, which was a bit of an interesting quest for the past 4, 6, 8 years, 10, I guess, really, since it's been passed. So I think Democrats' number one focus is definitely be health care. Shoring up the ACA. I know short-term health plans are something that they plan on targeting right off the bat. The Trump administration expanded the use of short-term health plans and allowing those to be offered. I think Democrats in the House will definitely fight to get that changed. Of course, Lamar Murray, ACA stabilization package that was bandied about so much last year while Republicans were working to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. You could see that resurrected. You'll see issues like the health insurance Cadillac tax, medical device tax. Those were bipartisan issues that saw short-term delays in this Congress that Democrats could look to as a bipartisan kind of compromise issues. And then, of course, drug pricing, something everyone's talked about. We saw Pelosi mention it, we saw Trump mention it, we've seen McConnell mention it all this week as an area that they think they could cooperate on. And I think, the House Democrats especially are going to have to figure out the balance between, investigate and cooperate.
I like the way that sounds. That kind of, it rolls off your
tongue. That was a good brainstorm this morning for me. And I think, it's a very delicate balance and dance they're going to have to do. And I think that plays out slowly. I think it's hard to predict because, again, depending how leadership elections go, et cetera, the committee chairmen because of actually Republican changes to the rules in the House, committee chairmen have even more wider latitude with subpoena power, which could obviously spur investigations. And I know, again, as we discussed, Frank Pallone, Richard Neal, and then the subcommittee level, Lloyd Doggett and Anna Eshoo likely, they're going to be anxious to go after Trump, to go after the Republicans for what they believe they've done in the healthcare world. But that will probably, again, make it harder to cooperate on any issue if they're going after the president. I don't see Trump as someone that's willing to be of two minds and understand the political and the policy sides can be separate. So,
any thoughts on the Senate's health agenda largely and healthcare particularly?
Yeah, I mean, as John touched on before, with the House flipping to the Democrats, any efforts to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act are totally dead. That will not happen. And if there is some kind of package, I think John mentioned it, it would be something similar to the Alexander Murray bill that was introduced in the Senate last year, but never actually was introduced on the floor for a vote. I think we would see something like that. It garnered a lot of bipartisan support, and it was something that Republicans and Democrats could work together on.
What was David, what were the components of that bill that you think it could come back?
It would have shore up the ACA markets and the insurance markets and add cost-sharing subsidies. It centered around that. And in terms of legislative vehicles in the Senate and in the House for any kind of healthcare items in the next Congress, what we have is there are several what we call Medicare extenders. So these are Medicare programs that were authorized. I think most of these were authorized in 2017, but they have to be reauthorized for 2020. So these are must-pass legislation. So because of that, you might be able to tack on things like the medical device tax, HIT, any other healthcare items could be riders with this kind of legislation. These programs are special diabetes program, state health insurance program, and community health centers. So we could see that as a potential legislative vehicle for any healthcare items heading into the next Congress.
Thanks, David. That's interesting. Kevin, now we've got governors and legislatures, so we have perhaps people on the same agenda and perhaps not, as you've illustrated. Where do you see healthcare in the states?
Yeah, just taking a historical perspective, going back a decade, I ran state government affairs for a large medical device and pharmaceutical company, and not a lot has changed. If you go to, and I do, events where state legislators and governors are, you almost don't know their party. They are universally concerned about cost, have been in the past, and continue to be. You know, you constantly hear bundled payments and capitated rates and how do we lower drug costs? That hasn't changed. What techniques they're going to use and how they're going to do it, that's sort of the key from their perspective. They want to hear those things to lower their overall exposure to healthcare costs. The red state governors have been in a real tough position when it comes to expanding Medicaid. They have had a lot of pushback to make it look like they're in bed with the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and folks who are moving farther to the right, or even in more moderate states, the Democrats have pushed them into a bit of a box on that. So I think the residents of Utah, the governors of Utah, Idaho, and Nebraska are really happy about that. I've heard constantly, I'm hearing clients of ours talk about what's Texas going to do, what Florida, just because the populations are so big around that, and they look for ways around that with CMS waivers and other ways to be able to do that. I think one of the other important things to think about when you think about the states is often there's the sort of laboratories that ideas take root to see what takes place in those states. Interestingly, in California, we have Gavin Newsom, the incoming governor, who is young, has his sights set on potentially 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, as opposed to the outgoing governor, Jerry Brown, who is both the youngest ever California governor and now the oldest. Jerry Brown had his own ideas on things, despite the fact that the legislature at times teetered on or had a supermajority of Democrats. He went his own way. I see Gavin Newsom probably playing ball more with the legislature to pass things, to have marquee events, especially around health care. On the other side of the country, in New York, the Democrats now have a true majority in the New York State Senate. For years, Republicans caucused with a bunch of different Democrats that were called a number of different things at different times. That is going to be gone in 2019. So I think those two states, especially, you'll see new, unique programs. I come out of Massachusetts. I'm one of the co-authors of healthcare reform back in 2005 and 2006, Universal Healthcare Bill. They're always looking at a new healthcare bill. So is Vermont, and so are other states. So I think you're going to see ideas come from the states that the feds may look at, regardless of what party brought them up, as long as it's around cost savings, included with hopefully better patient outcomes.
So Kevin, building on that, and for John and David, the states are often the place where you see things start. To your point, importation.
Yeah.
So Utah actually passed an importation bill allowing the residents to import, or I don't know if it's been implemented, but I know,
Right.
I know that other states have actually introduced similar legislation. Where do you guys see importation from the federal side? And Kevin, I expect, and maybe I'm wrong, but I expect more states will look at this option for residents as they see other states successfully passing the bill.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, obviously. The idea that importation would lead to lower drug costs is simplistic in some ways, and I think to some extent it might be a politically viable passage in a red, blue, or purple state overall, but whether or not, I haven't looked at the numbers as to whether or not that truly is going to lower drug costs for all populations or certain populations that are out there. Regardless, states are going to try anything they possibly can. It's a complicated matter. The state budgets are just over the last decade have gotten increasingly large in terms of their Medicaid population, the state workers and state retiree populations, and it's all across the board. It's a big problem, and they're looking for any solutions regardless of party.
Yeah, I will say, either last night or the night before, I saw my first importation commercial here in D.C. They're probably running just in our market, but the industry is certainly, aware and getting ahead of this. And I think, you saw last year in the Senate actually had a vote on an importation proposal, and, it went down with significant opposition from a number of Democrats. Even folks like Cory Booker voted against it. I think, things move quickly, and I think we're at a much different place than we were even 2 years ago when that happened, and I would be surprised to see someone like Cory Booker vote against that again. But I think the industry over the past, several years, as that issue has really been at the forefront at least, has done a very good job educating members of Congress, senators, the powers that be on the problems with importation. I think they really did a great job educating folks on that, and that's something that will endure. So, it is kind of funny that while you hear so much about drug pricing and all the proposals, importation, while of course it's always out there, it hasn't been something that I've seen, at least in the press and just from talking to people, that seems to be at the top of anyone's mind as something they would push right off the bat. I think you do see with the administration's, kind of proposals recently last month, the international reference pricing is kind of a, in the overall functionally it works similarly. Obviously, you're pulling in the prices from overseas, whether you do it by purchasing the drugs or setting price controls. So I think that, is taking some of the attention away. But I think even that proposal is, from what we've kind of gathered, might be a little bit of a threat to try to get people to the table, say, okay, well, if you don't, this is what we could do. But if you come to the table and negotiate something else, we'll put our guns down.
Interesting. So if we could just take a step, I know we've talked a lot about pricing for drugs, but let's talk about Medicare Part D in particular, and the interest in the House on negotiations, direct negotiations, as a way to control the price. I know that Congressman Cummings, Welch, and Doggett had a bill to do just that, and if prices could not be agreed upon, then the potential for the government to come in and compulsory license and really take away the patent protection and the intellectual property of the pharmaceutical company was a reality. Is that something you think we'll see again now that the leadership has shifted? And then, David, what's the potential for the Senate to respond to that?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Congressman Doggett, he will be likely Health Subcommittee Chairman. Elijah Cummings will be a chairman himself. It always is interesting. It's a lot easier to do things, especially bold things like that, proposals like that when you're in the minority, and you know that this bill will not come up. It will not move even in one chamber. And then when all of a sudden you're in the majority, as the House Republicans have learned for the last 8 years, it's time to put your money where your mouth is. So I think that it remains to be seen whether they will be that aggressive. I wouldn't be surprised to see them reintroduce that bill because it is a good talking point. They'll want it out there. But, that would be a fight that I think I would be surprised if they expended enough political capital on that kind of fight at that kind of level right off the bat. I think there are more modest proposals out there that are more attractive that could potentially garner bipartisan support. And I think that's one dynamic. And I apologize for saying dynamic about 58 times today, but we're prognosticating. I think that, right, does the Democratic House see it, okay, if we could pass a bill with most of our caucus and add on 30 Republicans to a drug pricing or otherwise, or whatever it might be, prescription drug related bill, and then we send it to the Senate with 285, does that make it that harder for the Senate to not take it up, et cetera, versus you got taking a hard line, passing things with only Democratic votes, where Mitch McConnell over in the Senate, and I don't want to take David's spot, but Mitch McConnell will just be able to leave that on the floor because he doesn't have any Republican members saying, well, look, three of the guys in my state in the House voted for this. What are we going to do? So, again, majority with majority comes responsibility that kind of does sometimes temper actions. And again, it's kind of the investigation versus cooperation dynamic the House Democrats need to feel out, and what kind of threat alert they're willing to throw out there.
Yeah, like what John was saying, I don't think anything like direct negotiation, like that dogged bill that he referenced, is going to go anywhere in the Senate. But what we could see is some kind of compromise on drug pricing, because again, the administration has been very supportive of it. You have a few Republicans, such as Mitch McConnell and Grassley, who are up in 2020, who might be forced to come to this more populist drug pricing platform, albeit a more moderate than direct negotiation. So you could see some compromise there in that regard. And another thing, just in the overall Senate caucus, which is important to note that I didn't touch on earlier, is you have some moderates such as Jeff Flake and Bob Corker. They retired this year, and then obviously those departures of McCaskill, Heitkamp, and Joe Donnelly, who were not McCaskill, but the two latter ones were pretty moderate Democrats on the Senate side, and you replace them with three pretty conservative Trump-backed Republicans. So you have in the Senate, when it comes down to nominations or any kind of very close party line vote, you're loosening the amount of power that a Collins or Murkowski will now have. So that's another important dynamic to note when you're talking about these party line votes.
So both John and David, you indicated that you think bipartisanship may in fact be real as we move into the 116th Congress. I know there's some of us, I'm not saying I'm one of them, but possibly some of us are a little suspect that is actually possible, though hopeful, I will say. I really would like your honest perspective about how you feel the Congress will function in terms of getting things done.
Yeah, and they're going to have some tests right off the bat, right? We have, in the lame duck even will be interesting to watch out, but, government funding expires December 7th, and that will likely be kicked into the new year. So, we'll have government funding, we'll have a debt ceiling, early in the first few months that are the must-dos of all must-dos. We say must-do a lot, but really those two are it. So I think watching how that goes, are Republicans willing to help out at all on those votes come in the new year? Republicans have had to rely on Pelosi and her caucus to pass a lot of those kind of bills the last decade, or last 8 years. And will that favor be returned? I think likely not, and that will certainly set a tone right off the bat. And again, it kind of comes down to, what do those investigations look like right out of the bat? I don't see this president, and again, guessing what Trump thinks or is going to do is a fool's errand, but I don't see this president as soon as he starts feeling the heat of some of those investigations, his folks start getting subpoenaed and having to testify. I don't see that as setting the stage for kind of any bipartisan cooperation going forward. Now, we could harken back to the Clinton triangulation strategies where Trump kind of sets out by himself and plays the two halves of Congress off each other. and has, so it kind of sets up this three-way dynamic. And he might be interested in working with Democrats to try to maybe, protect himself and his administration a bit on one side. But 2020 is going to kick right off too. I think, I just think, again, the dynamics here don't set themselves up well for bipartisan compromise. Though I think Democrats always, forever, will have the default setting is seeking bipartisan cooperation. I don't think that will endure past this spring.
David?
Yeah, to echo what John said, the two real legislative items that people have already, Pelosi, Trump, McConnell, have already indicated as popular potential areas of bipartisan agreement are drug pricing, which we already talked about, and infrastructure. And infrastructure over the past, 10 years or so has always just been known as a stand-in for bipartisan compromise. They haven't actually done anything about it, but boy, they love talking about how we all agree on infrastructure. So, it is something that both parties have said that they're willing to come to the table on. It's clear that we're in need of some kind of infrastructure package. It's a question of whether they can hash out their differences, because there are big disagreements over things such as public-private partnerships and also just the overall price tag that many Republicans might not be willing to support given the debt deficit and things of that nature. So, but just throwing it out there, that's something that they've been talking about, so important to note.
As you've mentioned, John, we're near 2020, so Kevin,
Yep.
let me get your perspective on how important this legislative cycle was in setting up redistricting in 2020.
Yeah, really, really important. And I think the Republicans typically have done a much better job, specifically over the last decade or so, of taking a look at those state legislative races and really putting together teams of folks to support Republicans in the state to get those majorities, which, again, for those folks who don't pay too much attention to redistricting, some people just call it straight out gerrymandering, they get an opportunity, the state legislatures typically, to set up the congressional districts as well as the districts for state house and state senate. So it means a ton, it means a lot. Again, the Republican governors were at historical highs in the legislatures pretty much as well. That's come back a little at the midterms. So the battles, if you're looking at the slide, we're only looking at 11 governorships versus 36 this go around in 2020. But those are big, big fights, especially where those state legislative seats are going to be up. You have places like Virginia in 2019 that the entire legislature is up as well. They're one of those, they and New Jersey are the oddball states that go on a little bit, they go on the off years. But those are crucially important. And again, historically, the Republicans have been much better organized and done a better job overall of pulling that through.
So let's talk about 2020, because I feel like even though we just a week ago literally a week ago, have cast our votes, let's talk about from the perspective of the House, which runs every 2 years, Senate, and as this will be a presidential year. What are your insights as to how quickly this will heat up, what it will likely look like? And please, anyone, John, David, jump in.
I'm sorry to steal a little bit of the Senate side thunder, but you're going to have probably at least 6 Democratic senators running for president in 2020. I think that.
Are you willing to throw out some names?
Sure. I think Cory Booker, Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, Sherrod Brown, right, said yesterday that he would be interested.
Elizabeth Warren, of course.
Elizabeth Warren, yeah. Amy Klobuchar, and I think I think Jeff Merkley had some mumblings about running earlier this year. You're going to get a couple of those out of nowhere. Bernie Sanders, of course, could run again. So that's kind of be paramount. Whether they've got their eyes ahead, and I think you saw that some of that even playing out this year in the Kavanaugh hearings. That Kamala Harris, Cory Booker definitely knew this was a chance to make a name for themselves and took advantage of that opportunity. And while that was certainly a unique situation all in itself, as we continue to get closer to 2020. Remember, Trump declared in March of 2015, so that's this coming March, the equivalent. So, we're going to get right into it. We're going to see a debt ceiling government funding deal done this spring, and then you're going to have people officially announcing their runs for president, not that they're unofficially already not there. So that does dominate. Then you turn Congress into a messaging vehicle for those campaigns, for the parties. What messages do they think are going to resonate in 2020? And that begins to set the agenda a little bit. If they're not compromising, if bipartisan compromise on infrastructure, the enduring hope, et cetera, does not come to fruition, Congress is stuck doing what Congress has done for too long now, which is passing funding bills, must-pass stuff, and not much else, and messaging. And that, that definitely could lead to hearings where they haul up CEOs or whoever it might be, and get them on TV, get them on camera, and grill them, where it might not lead to legislative proposals or legislative outcomes, but that certainly has its own pitfalls and downsides as well. So I think that's the story, that Congress quickly becomes a messaging vehicle for the 2020 elections.
Kind of echoing what John said, the Republicans on the Senate going into 2020, they have kind of the opposite of what happened this year, where you saw a lot of Democrat seats that were up and a few Republicans that were up. It totally flips in 2020, and the Republicans have to defend 22 seats, and a lot of those are in purple states such as Colorado, Georgia now potentially, and so you might see a situation where some of these Republican senators start to moderate a little bit because they know they have an impending election where they could be forced out. Another trend that I touched on earlier was the Trump bump in states like Indiana and Missouri and North Dakota, where Trump actively campaigned there and pretty much doubled down on his divisive rhetoric to ultimately win. And part of that strategy was pulling an immense amount of rural turnout and rural voters who unprecedentedly voted for Braun over Donnelly in that example. So now that Trump is, he frames everything in a realm of winning and losing, he sees that as a win. So unfortunately, we could look at a situation where he might try to double down on his hyper-partisan, brash strategy heading into 2020, which could hurt these more moderate Republicans. As you saw, it was reported in the news, but in the last coming days before the election, Trump's advisors all wanted him to go with a message of, oh, look at the economy is great right now, you can thank us for the economy, but instead he opted to go with a very harsh anti-immigrant message. So, we could see more of that if he thinks that that's a winning strategy.
So, David, your point about pulling the rural versus the city vote, thinking about, the east and west coasts and then the middle of the country, do you see that same, moving into the next election cycle, that same issue where you've got your blue kind of edges to the country and still that largely red middle, or do you think that's modifying?
I think it's going to stay the same, if not even worsen, as we saw in this election, because of what John talked about earlier on the House side, where you had these more suburban or exurban districts that flipped, that were reliably red for dozens of years, and they flipped to blue. But on the rural side, areas in the Midwest and Minnesota in particular, you saw two areas that were traditional, Union Democrat worker areas that got more and more red, and these are the Obama-Trump districts that voted for Obama but then voted for Trump. And so you see this kind of rural-urban divide intensifying, and I don't really see that anything changing on that front.
If I can just add, with the 2020 race, we have it's been a decade or so since we had one, but governors obviously like to run and have been successful. Carter and Reagan and Bush and Clinton. among others. As you look at the map out there, Andrew Cuomo is a perennial candidate. He's had his ups and downs in New York. He's got a Senate on his side now. He might be able to get some legislative accomplishments out there. On the other side of the country, I mentioned previously Gavin Newsom in the state of California. Everyone thinks he's got his sights out there. Two governors to pay attention to in the Democratic side of the aisle that you may not be paying attention to as 2020 comes up is Phil Murphy in New Jersey, in full disclosure, a former boss of mine going back a number of years, but a Goldman Sachs executive. He was the ambassador to Germany. He's very dynamic, very go-getter type of person. Similar but a bit more low-key, Steve Bullock, the governor of a very red state of Montana, also is somebody who's out there and active and will look at the race as well. So it'll be interesting to see if the governors end up playing there. I often say, as you look at the presidential races too, it can be easier for a governor to be able to do so because you don't miss the votes. And the bills wait for you on your desk, or you fly into the Capitol, you sign 100, and then you fly off to Iowa and New Hampshire again. It's a little more difficult when your primary opponents, have that rolling list of the bills that you missed voting on over and over again. It makes it look like you're not somebody who's active and participating because you're hanging out in Manchester or Concord or in Dubuque, Iowa.
Any chance that Trump will be primaried? We're prognosticating.
I mean, I don't see it now. I mean, I think someone like Kasich would love to. I'm sure he's considering it. Not to get too deep into it, but I think, depending what happens with Mueller, depending what happens with, any investigations launched by the Democrats, if there's substantial there, I think that could happen. Besides that, I have a tough time seeing it. But I think, it is interesting with Trump, and maybe not 2020, though, you're seeing the Oprahs, the Rocks, Howard Schultz, kind of these celebrity slash CEO people, taking this a little bit more seriously. And I think depending how 2020 goes, how Trump does the second time around, if he is there, I think we could see some pretty interesting people jump into the race. And again, who knows with the crowded, if you got a few governors up there, you got a handful of senators up there, you never knew. Obviously, we saw with Trump who could break through the noise. Now, the Democratic Party is not the Republican Party for sure, but ultimately they need somebody that can beat them.
Right. Interesting. Very interesting. This has been a really great conversation. I have to thank you all for your insights, your willingness to share them, your candor. Really, truly cannot thank you enough for providing that to us today. I wanted to let the folks on the phone know that everything has been recorded and is available. And should you have any questions or want to reach out, certainly you can reach me as well. I want to thank Spectrum for giving us this opportunity to host today and share with you the insights. Kevin, David, and John, thank you so much for your time and expertise. Truly appreciate it and look forward to seeing whether we have, in fact, predicted what we will see in 2019 or whether we will all be surprised. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.